Welcome to our latest series of the Harbour Voices podcast. For this series, we're shining a light on Aberdeen's Festival of the Sea and the community programme Open Road has created as part of the wider festival offering. In this series, we're taking a deep dive into the rich maritime history and heritage of Fitty and Torry, Aberdeen's two harbourside communities, and exploring what the sea means to them. It's being created ahead of the tall ships arriving into Aberdeen in 2025 and the Festival of the Sea that will accompany it. Both are a celebration of Aberdeen's histories and stories of the city's harbour area and the creative journeys that have made this festival an unforgettable voyage. Welcome to our latest episode of the Harbour Voices podcast, and today we're joined by Jack, who is a countryside ranger. Hi Jack, do you want to just tell me a little bit about your job?
So I always say that a countryside ranger has two main responsibilities. The first thing that we do is we manage 25 of Aberdeen's green spaces for wildlife.
Wow.
So from a conservation perspective, looking after the animals, the plants, the fungi, you name it. The other thing that we do is we manage these areas so that people can access and enjoy them in a safe and responsible way.
Wow, so that seems like it's quite a varied job then.
Every day's a little bit different.
Yeah,
you're never quite sure what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, and we met you for the first time during Festival of the Sea, which is kind of what this podcast is all about, is capturing those moments from the Festival of the Sea. And when we met, you were actually in the middle of doing a rock pooling day with young people. Can you tell us a bit about that side of your job?
So a huge part of what we do is sort of public engagement with either school groups or just the general public. So the whole purpose of that was really to sort of showcase some of the amazing intertidal species that we have around Aberdeen. I think rock pool events, they're always our most well-attended events. They're always really good fun because I think people are surprised at just how much you can find right on your doorstep. So the idea was really just sort of give people maybe a newfound appreciation for some of the animals right on our doorstep, and yeah, a bit of species ID and things as well.
Yeah, and it really was. Like the day that it happened, the sun was absolutely, shining in the sky. There was loads of families, children were getting right involved, and what I loved was just the energy that you were bringing to it with your colleague as well. You seem to know so much about the kind of species that we have just in Aberdeen. And many people think, well, we don't have much, but I mean, from your perspective, you're seeing things all the time. What kind of things were you showing the kids during the Festival of the Sea workshop?
Well, it was a huge selection of different things. So we were finding quite a few different species of crabs, so things like the edible crab, the shore crab, hermit crabs, as well as a few species of different fish as well. So if my mind serves me right, things like the butterfish as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a good mix.
And it sounds like almost a dream job, because you get to go out and you've got all this like vast knowledge of all these kind of species, and it's not just sea sort of animals that you're looking at, it's just everything, as you were saying at the beginning. What do you think is, how do you get into this kind of career?
It's always been an interest of mine, and sort of when I was finishing up university, I studied biology at university, and as I was finishing up, I realised that being in a lab, you can be working on the most exciting topic. But at the end of the day, data is data. So to see things like this, you actually have to be out and about in the field. So that's why I decided that it was a career that I wanted to pursue. But I got into this mainly through volunteering. So I'd volunteered with the Ranger Service a few times. Funnily enough, it was actually one of their rock pooling events. I asked if I could come along and help out with that because it's always been a bit of a passion. And yeah, from there I was eventually offered a 6-month contract, and almost 3 years later I'm still here. So
wow,
doing something right, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose like no 2 days must be the same, because I mean, what was that you're saying, 25 areas that you're...
Yeah, 25 different sites around the city.
Wow, so you don't have to list all of them, but what are some of those areas for people listening?
So there's 4 local nature reserves in Aberdeen. So that's the Donmouth Local Nature Reserve, Kingcorth Hill, or the Gramps as you probably know it if you're from Aberdeen, the Den of Maidencraig Nature Reserve, as well as Scotstoun Moor Local Nature Reserve. But there's other places as well. I said they're around Aberdeen. There is one on sort of the border of the Shire, which is Carney Woods.
Okay.
A really good spot for red squirrels. But yeah, other places like, let me think, across the road from Scotstoun Moor you've got Eastwood Croft, and yeah.
And I suppose you said part of your job is this kind of public engagement, but it's also maintaining these areas, right? So that they stay nice and open to the public, and making sure the diversity of what kind of things are you doing when you're going out, I suppose?
It's very seasonal. I mean, a huge amount of my time, pretty much the bulk of work that we carry out is to do with removing invasive plant species.
Really?
So that can be native plants, things like bracken or gorse, that are encroaching upon areas, altering the habitat, essentially just becoming a sea of bracken or a sea of gorse, so not good biodiversity. The other thing is removing plants that have been introduced to this country, so I mean things like that have escaped from gardens, for example, so rhododendron, and then harmful plants like giant hogweed and Japanese knotweed as well.
Wow. So as you're going about taking down those kind of things that shouldn't really be there, they're taking over the biodiversity, are you also seeing kind of like unusual like species or things that are quite common to Aberdeen? Like if someone was to go out to one of these areas, what would they most likely see?
I always say it's a bit like a lucky dip. You're never too sure. I mean, of course, there's animals and there's plants and things that you can expect to see. So, I mean, one that immediately comes to mind are things like the songbirds. You know, you're always going to see a robin, you're always going to hear a wren and things like that. But one that does come to mind as well is I was out doing something this week, and one of the people that I was out doing the event with found this moth.
Oh.
And it's called a herald moth, and I've only seen the herald moth twice in my life.
Wow.
So I was quite excited by seeing it. So you're never too sure. I mean, Aberdeen's got some really amazing wildlife, and it's got a good variety of wildlife. So if you expect to find it in the area, you're probably going to find it in Aberdeen.
Yeah. And you told us that you kind of first got into it, well, you were at a rock pooling event yourself, and obviously during Festival of the Sea, that's what you were doing with the young people. Can you tell me, have you got that kind of connection yourself? Has it been going on since you were a boy, kind of going out into the sea and like rock pooling? Do you have any nice memories of that?
It's always been an interest. I really got into that. It was through actually my dad and my granddad taking me rock pooling when I was very little. My granddad grew up in Stonehaven, so he always had that connection with the sea, and you know he would visit the rock pools at places like Cowie and Stonehaven as well.
Wow.
So I was taken to Cove Bay because it's, you know, a lot closer by, easier to get to, and yeah, from there it just sort of sparked an interest, and yeah, developed into a passion and eventually a career. So I've got a lot of fond memories of being down there with my dad and my granddad. Yeah,
and do they sort of be able to identify some of the like crabs or things, or are they just like more just interested in themselves?
I got quite a few of the local names off my granddad actually and things, but by no means I think they were actually accepted.
Yeah.
But you know, a lot of the idea was just then getting books about it and researching it, and when you see something new, you maybe think, well, what was that? I'll have a look at the book. So picking things up from that, picking things up from like-minded people as well.
And would you say, what's your kind of connection to the sea? Do you have one, would you say?
A connection, see, that's a good question. I've lived in Aberdeen my entire life, so I've always been in an area with access to the sea, and I always have seen it as a very special place, like I've said, you know, because I've got memories with my dad and my granddad and whatnot. So it's a very nostalgic thing, I think I would say. But yeah, I mean, I've been going to the same location my entire life and things, so yeah, it's a very, very fun place.
Yeah, and for people that maybe aren't quite, they might be in Aberdeen, they might be further afield, people are listening to this podcast. So do you want to just sort of say some of the things that you might see in Aberdeen if you're going about the seaside, you know, kind of maybe things that people take for granted up here but actually are quite rare or specific to the northeast?
So one thing that I think is quite nice in Aberdeen, if you're doing a commute in Aberdeen and you're crossing over the River Don, you're probably going to see these animals. There's actually a small colony of harbour seals that we have just upstream of I believe it's the Ellen Road Bridge. So we're quite lucky to have seals right in the middle of the city. I think that's rather lovely. We've got a good selection of different seabirds as well. You can actually see gannets off of Aberdeen. They're quite hard to spot, but just look for the big white bird, and if you see it dive, definitely a gannet. So that's quite nice as well, because people travel really far to photograph these animals. But on the smaller scale, I mean, within the rock pools themselves, there's pretty much a limitless supply of animals and plants that you can see. A standout find for me last year was actually finding a European eel in one of the rock pools, and the European eel is special because it's critically endangered.
Oh wow.
And it's the only one I've ever seen out of that spot, despite going there for, you know, close to 26 years now, like I'm saying. So
wow.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to find, and you can see some really nice things. So
yeah, and you were sort of saying when we were talking earlier, like, you've been going to the same places and you're noticing, like, sometimes you're seeing things that you haven't seen before. And do you think that's to do with sort of the, you know, global warming, or what are you sort of thinking? What's your thoughts on that kind of thing?
To be decided, if I'm honest. As I say, it would be easy to say, yeah, it's to do with the changing oceans and things, because, you know, like I'm saying, I'm identifying these animals when I'm smaller. So when I'm seeing something new, it's a matter of, I think that animal is starting to appear, and opposed to me just not noticing it before.
Yeah.
I'm really not too sure. I would have to have a look at that one, but I know that specifically in the ocean, you know, minute temperature changes, the animals can be very sensitive to that. And there has been some studies on rock pools in other parts of the UK, and they are noticing sort of a changing community of the rock pool as the ocean gets warmer.
Yeah.
So, you know, in the future, some species might become more common, I suppose, and opposed to the ones I see now. I'm really not too sure. I suppose it's a matter of time will tell, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And would that have a big impact on our kind of like biodiversity? And is that something to worry, or is it kind of like welcome, or, you know?
I think the main thing is, species that like cold water, if the water's getting too warm, they're going to be pushed further north.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be replaced by the animals that can tolerate the warmer water.
Yeah.
So it really is going to be a complete shift in the dynamic of the rock pools, and that can have big consequences if these animals are, one, a food source, or two, an important predator.
Okay, yeah.
And there's some very unique symbiosis in rock pools as well. So that's animals or plants that rely on each other as well for survival.
Okay.
So if you lose one, you might not be able to have another one present.
Yeah.
And then, of course, everything that relies on that can therefore not be present.
So it has that kind of knock-on.
It is a knock-on effect as well, yeah.
And do you think that, you've as you've been doing this since you're a boy, and obviously you've got, all these kind of Latin and Greek words for these kind of common things that we see. Some of them are really kind of interesting names that you find, that's what they're called. Could you possibly share some of those kind of Latin names and what they translate as?
So if we're sticking with the marine theme, as I say, a very charismatic animal is, of course, the puffins that you have around here. The scientific name of the puffin, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but I believe it's Fratricula arctica, and that roughly translates as little brother of the Arctic, which I think is rather lovely. But I'm going back to the gannets as well. You've got the Latin name, or the scientific name, I should say, of the gannet is Morus basanus, and that's a literal translation of the moron of Bass Rock. Bass Rock, of course, being one of the main hotspots, the colonies for the northern gannet, so a bit of history there as well. Yeah,
I know, you were telling me a little bit about the kind of folklore that kind of follows these species as well, and I think there was a quite nice one about the gannet, wasn't there? There was was that the one that they thought were really silly animals?
Yeah, so the moron part of that actually comes from the fact that the gannet hasn't really got much, if any, natural predators. So historically, when the northern gannet was harvested for food, you could land a boat on Bass Rock, walk up to a nesting gannet and pick it up. It's pretty much the same situation as the dodo, and that lack of fear was interpreted by some people as the bird being very stupid, and that is reflected in the binomial name of the animal. But of course, it is not the case whatsoever. It's literally dodo situation, as I'm saying.
I know, that's like so shocking. And I suppose like the common seagull that everyone in Aberdeen just kind of, some people call them rats with wings. They're not very loved, but you've got a deep appreciation of them, don't you?
Everything has a place, I think. I mean, especially native species like the seagull. So the fact is, there's no such thing as a seagull. So the seagull is used to refer to various different types of gull. So the classic seagull would be the herring gull. They're the ones that have got the grey back. Then you get the black-backed gulls, which are two species separated by the colour of the leg. So yeah, I like gulls. But they are one of those things, they are meant to be there. There are seabirds, and, they've maybe been displaced because of human activity, things like fishing, for example. It might just be that they've adapted really well to sort of, human settlements and whatnot as well.
Yeah.
But I always think, as much as people aren't very fond of seagulls, going to the beach and then not hearing them, I think that would be a really strange, almost wrong and eerie experience, because it's synonymous with being at the seaside, really, isn't it? Hearing the gulls.
And they're protected as well, aren't they? So it doesn't matter what an Aberdonian might say, and I'm not saying we all don't like them, but
For a start, I mean, Aberdeen seagulls are built different. They are absolutely massive, so I can appreciate maybe people being a bit hesitant of them, but yeah, they are protected, and I think they're persecuted a lot because of the fact people view them as rats with wings. But the fact of the matter is, that the herring gull, last time I looked anyway, is on the amber list, so it's not doing as well as we would hope. So just because we're seeing lots of them and having a lot of our food stolen by them, it's not the case elsewhere in the world. So, we do need to look after our gulls.
Yeah, and you were telling me earlier, because you've got a vast knowledge, like even people hearing that, like you can tell the difference between gulls and, you've clearly studied them for a long time. There was something you were telling me before about, meeting a fisherman and him actually helping you identify things. So it's not everything that you can read in a book. It's like you've just got such a passion outside it.
It's local knowledge for a lot of things as well. I mean, especially if you're wanting to see a specific animal, you really do need that local knowledge of distribution and sort of abundance and things like that. But with regards to species ID, it can be really useful as well, because the ID books don't have it all. I'm not quite sure why they don't have some of the tips that should be included in them.
Yeah, and what was the one that you were asking the fisherman for?
So it's a small fish that you can find. There's two different species, I should say. You can find them off Aberdeen, actually. Cove Bay is a really good spot to see them. They're called sea scorpions. Even though they're not scorpions, they are in fact fish. Not to be confused with the scorpion fish. Anyway. There are two different species, and I mean, if you look in the book, they'll tell you can distinguish the short spine species from the long spine species by the proportion of the fish's body that's taken up by its head. But that's completely subjective. I might look at that and say, yeah, the head's large enough to be this species. You might disagree. Nowhere in any ID guide that I found does it tell you that if you look at the corner of the long spine species mouth, there will be a small whisker, which is absent in the short spine sea scorpion.
Yeah.
And that is a definitive way to distinguish the two species. But I learned that it was actually on a fishing website, I believe, because someone was asking about the differences.
Yeah.
And sure enough, if you actually dig deeper, it is unique to these two fish.
Yeah. And it is clear that, I mean, it's clear that you have all this knowledge and care and passion for it. You actually, outside this, you like taking photographs, don't you?
Yeah, I'd say I'm a bit of an amateur wildlife photographer.
Yeah.
I haven't got a clue how a camera works, but as I say, it's more about being out and actually seeing the animals. And it's just a very mindful thing to be out in nature as well. You get time to think, so yeah.
Yeah, you were telling me about, what is it that you're looking for? It seems quite elusive to you at the moment. There's a new, is it a butterfly that some people have seen in Aberdeen?
There is. So butterflies, at least most species of butterfly only really appear for a few months of the year, and a few species appear in sort of chunks throughout the year. So they'll fly once in sort of May, for example, and then reappear in September. The one I'm after is the holly blue butterfly. That's a butterfly that you tend to associate more with the south of the UK. They're very, very common in England, but they are starting to creep further north as well, and they're becoming quite common in the likes of, Fife and Edinburgh and whatnot. But last year there was the first record of a holly blue in Aberdeen, and it was not just one, it was actually two butterflies. So I'm always keeping my eye out for them, but I'm probably going to be heading south at some point soon to try and see them before they finish for the year.
Yeah, so that passion that takes you further than Aberdeen to look around.
Yeah, as I say, I've been all over sort of chasing wildlife, and it always seems to be butterflies, so it seems to be leading towards that now and things. But yeah, I mean, everywhere I go, I'm always wondering what the local wildlife is like and trying to see as much as possible.
Yeah, and do you plan your holidays around things like that?
I do actually. I've gotten quite good at saying saying to my partner, this area looks really nice, and it'll be because there's an ulterior motive of a very rare such and such there instead at that time of year. So our trip to Bristol this year was pretty much geared around me trying to see some of the southern species of butterfly.
Oh wow.
Didn't manage, but that's alright, I'll just have to go back.
Yeah, that's it.
Another holiday.
Another holiday, exactly. And so another big part of your job when you're doing your countryside rangering is also that kind of public engagement, and it's working with like little kids, probably all ages actually. Why do you think that's important?
I think for people to want to protect something, they need to care about it and they need to associate that with a positive experience.
Yeah.
And a lot of wildlife, specifically when you get to mini beasts, things like spiders, things like insects, there's a general negative sort of opinion of them, from the general public and things. So I feel like if you can show people that they really are amazing, and especially at an early age, you can maybe change people's opinions or just give them some food for thought. Or, the end goal for me is always sort of maybe catalysing an interest, just like my dad and my granddad did for me. I think if I can change someone's opinion of animals like that or give them a positive experience that they carry with them, then I always think that is my job done in that regard. Yeah.
And do you have any standout memories of when you've been doing that kind of public engagement?
One does jump to mind. It was quite recent actually. We were doing a session at Scotstoun Moor, and it was part of a school group. And to cut a long story short, there was a girl on that group, and was showing her various bits and bobs, explaining this is that, this is such and such. And then we did a follow-up session about a week or two later. And this was open to the general public, but she actually came back with her family, and she brought her little brother. And as we were walking around the moor, there were some areas that we passed on the first time that she was there, and she was repeating the information that I was saying to her back to her brother and things. So it was quite nice to see that someone had actually remembered and taken in what I was saying, and also sharing that information with someone else. And I think that's the good bit. It's sharing these experiences and helping people realise that we're very lucky to have what we have in Aberdeen.
Yeah, definitely. And if there's one place that you'd recommend for a member of the public to go, I know it's going to be hard because
Tough
there's so
question.
many, but is there anywhere that you'd say, right, if you haven't been to Aberdeen and you want to get some good wildlife or like local wildlife, or where should we go?
Can I pick two? Is
Yeah,
that
you
allowed?
can. Yeah,
I'll pick
okay.
two. Okay, so I've rattled on about it enough, so I'll keep this one short. But Cove Bay is a very nice spot. There is actually, it's just called the Coastal Footpath, so it pretty much does what it says on the tin. It's a nice walk along the cliffs. If you go there in the summer months, you'll be treated to the seabirds. So you'll see things like the fulmar, which is basically our own little version of an albatross. You'll get kittiwakes, razorbills, guillemots, all sorts of nice birds. You've got a good chance of seeing the dolphins, some lovely coastal meadows down there as well, so you'll get the insects, the butterflies, some really quite elusive insects as well, and if all else fails you can go rock pooling. So there's a good mix down at Cove Bay. Part of the area is also classed as a site of special scientific interest, so that's essentially the best example of that habitat or geology that we have in this part of the country, so it's really nice. Another spot that is definitely worth visiting, and again I'm biased, is the Kingcorth Hill Local Nature Reserve, so the Gramps. I once had an ecologist tell me that it's a poor example of a habitat because it's lots of little fragmented bits. I think that's part of the charm. There's a good mix of everything, and at the end of the day the wildlife doesn't mind what someone else classes it as. The wildlife is there. You go there at dusk, you'll get the bats, you'll get the owls, you get the tawny owl. If you're very lucky, you might see barn owls as well. I've only seen them once, but they are there. Badgers, foxes, a whole range of insects and invertebrates, you name it. So yeah, really easy walk too.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I think that's all the questions for today, but it's been so nice to meet you, Jack, and just like hearing your passion for this kind of work is just really inspiring.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I think it's brilliant.
Thank you for listening to this Harbour Voices podcast. This series has been created with the support of Aberdeen City Council. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share with others and check out the rest of our Harbour Voices episodes on www.openroadlimited.com.